Hello and good time, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Mustafa bin Ifard, and we're here with you from UBC and during the last lecture in the 2022 fall series of the lectures, Alireza Ahmadian lectures in Iranian and Persianate studies. Before anything, I would like to acknowledge that although we're doing this session virtually, that UBC Vancouver is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsalal-Watuth peoples. Also, before going on with the information about today's talk, I would like to mention that although our talk is not related or directly related to what's going on in Iran, which is of definitely most importance to the audiences of this series, we definitely stand in solidarity with the protesters in Iran. And with the main code or slogan, Women, Life, Freedom, and to respect especially the lives lost, particularly at the hands of the Islamic Republic and due to state violence. I would like to request, as we did during the last session, for a moment of silence before we begin our session. Thank you. Thank you very much. As you are aware, today's talk is titled Dressed in the Costume of His Country, Portraits of Persians Done in the West from 1600 to 1842. The panel comprises three scholars whom I will be introducing to you shortly. But before that, just a couple of preliminary remarks. I would like to thank my team of Kani, Mortaza, who is helping us today, and also Razman for the great poster designs. I would also like to remind you that there is the option for closed captioning, and you could activate it at any time, as far as I'm aware. Mortaza Jan, is that correct? And I think Mortaza is also posting some remarks and some comments to help you. And finally, I would like to ask you to please feel free to share your questions as Dr. Potts will be delivering his speech in the chat box. And of course, there will be time for Q&A afterward. So the format of the talk will be as follows. Dr. Potts will start delivering his speech. And then once he is finished, I'll invite Dr. Diba and Dr. Floor to join him for a discussion, brief discussion afterward. And of course, after that discussion, we'll open it to Q&A on the part of the audience, especially for questions on the part of the audience. And at this point, I would like to introduce our panelists. I asked them for permission to shorten and abridge their bios, but I would like to mention that these are shortened and again and abridged versions. The full versions of the biographies can be found on our website. Today's presenter, Dr. Daniel T. Potts, is Professor of Ancient Near Eastern Archaeology and History at the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World, New York University. His lifelong fascination with and love of Iranian history and archaeology began with his first visit to Iran in 1973 and has led him to work on a wide range of topics ranging in time from prehistory to the modern era. And then there comes a list of a lot of books. Again, feel free to please see the full bio on the website. Our discussant, Dr. Layla Diba, is an independent scholar, art advisor, and curator. She has been director and chief curator of the Nigaristan Museum in Tehran from 1975 to 79. Art advisor for the private secretariat of H.M. Queen Farah of Iran, Her Majesty, and Hagub Kevorkian, curator of Islamic art at the Brooklyn Museum of Art. From 1994 to 2006, she was visiting professor of Islamic art at Bard Graduate Center. And in 2006, Dr. Diba was invited to develop programming and a strategy for the future Guggenheim Abu Dhabi Museum and to serve on the museum's Asian Art Council and Middle East focus group. Again, I apologize for shortening the biography, but the full version can be found on the website. And finally, Dr. Willem Floor, another discussant tonight, studied development economics and non-Western sociology, as well as Persian, Arabic, and Islamology from 1963 to 67 at the University of Utrecht, the Netherlands. He received his doctoral degree from the University of Leiden in 1971, and since 1983, Dr. Floor was employed by the World Bank as an energy specialist. However, after his retirement in 2002, he has dedicated his time to the study of social and political history of Iran and has published extensively throughout this time. And for those who are, of course, familiar with his work, we know that he has numerous books and articles published in this regard. So with that, I would like to invite Dr. Potts to please join us. And I would also like to invite the audience to please welcome Dr. Potts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mustafa, for that introduction. And I would just like to second my wishes to express solidarity with the people of Iran in this very difficult time. I will share my screen with you, and that looks good. I should start by explaining a little bit about how I came to this topic, which is not something which is, let's say, self-evident. Most of you probably do not know me because I really am an archaeologist for the most part and work on more ancient aspects of Iranian history. But it was really accidentally in the course of doing, I'm just trying to, It was in the course of doing some research on something ancient that I came across these two small articles in a newspaper and a magazine from 1873. And I won't read the whole thing for you, but the gist of it is that in 1873, according to these articles, an American writer named Mansfield Tracy Walworth, who published a book called Delaplane, a novel. And in this, much of the novel is set in the Second Russo-Persian War. And allegedly, according to these articles, Nasr ad-Din Shah was so impressed by the realistic depiction of the conditions, the war, and especially Abbas Mirza, that he sent him a sword that had been used by Abbas Mirza as a present, as a sort of token of esteem, which this fellow Walworth then proposed to put on display in the State Library of New York in Albany. To cut a very long story short, this is probably all fiction, just like Walworth's novel. I've read the novel, and it's quite incredible in many ways. There's a lot of fantasy in it, but then there are pages and pages of absolutely detailed description of battles and events in the Second Russo-Persian War. And this made me wonder, how did an author living in upstate New York, he was based in Utica, New York, how did he get all of this contemporary, really very detailed reporting on Iran, on contemporary events in Iran at that time? And this led me to look at archives of newspapers, American newspapers, which happily have been digitized and which are really very easy to look for. And this led to the production of this work that you see here, Agreeable News from Persia, which is all about Iran, news about Iran in the American press from the early 18th century through to my cutoff was the end of the reign of Muhammad Shah. And in assembling all this material, which shows an amazing flow of news, constant flow of news about goings on in Iran through the downfall of the Safavid Empire, through the period of Nader Shah, Karim Khan, the rise of the Qajars. And in that, I met, so to speak, many interesting characters about whom I really knew nothing. One of them I'll be talking about a bit later was a bishop from Urmia, whose picture you see here, Mar Yohanna or Mar Yohanan, who befriended the American missionaries there, the Presbyterian missionaries who established a mission in Urmia in the early 1830s. And I came across this portrait of him. And I, in order to put that portrait into more context, I began to wonder about how many travelers from Iran outside of when they went to Europe or in his case came to America, how many actually had their portraits done. And it turns out it's relatively few, but it's a very interesting corpus of material, maybe less interesting for pure art historians, but certainly interesting for historians. And so I, again, looking around, finding a bit of information about the portraits, a bit of information, in many cases, quite a lot of information about the artists, in some cases, very little information, or the engravers or the lithographers. I decided it would be worth putting this all together into a book, because such a book really didn't exist about the portraiture of Iranians who had traveled outside of Iran in the from the 17th through the early 19th century. And that resulted in this book. It's a slim volume, and it has nothing to do with my day job, so to speak, my normal archaeological and sort of ancient historical work, but it was extremely interesting to do. And it did lead, in the process of doing the research, it led to a few discoveries of things that were not known. So tonight I want to, or today I want to show you some of this material, because much of it is really not very well known to people. And even when it's by some very well-known artists, these works tend not to be the ones that people think of when they think of those particular artists. This notion of portraiture is not something that we should assume is always and everywhere a feature of society. Of course, probably most of us are familiar with Roman portraits, portrait busts. So the notion of portraiture is not new. But as you can see from this quotation from Pietro Aretino in the mid-16th century, there were views about portraiture. that are interesting. So, for example, he clearly doesn't like the fact that tailors and butchers in his time even could be subjects of portraiture. And that kind of prejudice against ordinary people having their portraits painted is also shown very clearly in this quotation from the Earl of Fife from the late 18th century. So quite a long time after that fact, wherein he says that in the old days, so to speak, before this century, only people who were really from great families or had done something extremely distinguished for their country had their portraits painted. But nowadays, and he's writing in 1796, really anybody who can afford 20 pounds has portraits of himself and his wife and his children painted. Well, in the case of Iranians who traveled outside the country, my work really started off with the portraits done by an artist named Egidius Sadler, who hailed from Antwerp. And he found employment as the imperial engraver for Rudolf II, who was the Holy Roman Emperor in the late 16th, early 17th century. And Shah Abbas sent a number of ambassadors to him in order to hopefully negotiate an anti-Ottoman alliance. This was part of his thinking about trying to get some of the Christian powers on board to battle the Ottomans. So we have this, this is the first one that we look at of Hussein Ali Beg. And these are all done in Prague. This one, as you see, is in the Rijksmuseum. And as an engraver, he pays great attention, you can see, to the textiles, to the fabrics, to the fur. And this is typical of his work. Another ambassador sent by Shah Abbas to Rudolf II is Zainal Khan Shamlu. A couple of years later, we have this quotation from Father John Thaddeus, who was a Carmelite in Isfahan, writing in 1609, who clearly found that when Zainal returned, he was extremely dissatisfied. As he says, he wrote or spoke ill of the emperor and other Christian princes, saying that basically they were all talk and no action. What they wanted was for the Turks and the Persians to destroy each other and the Islamic religion in the process. And once again, there's a great, I think Sadler is extremely good at depicting textiles, and that sort of stands out markedly in this one too. And then we have Mehdi Quli Beg. This is one that's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where again, the textiles are beautifully and very intricately depicted, but we also have this falcon, which adds something quite special to it. So one can imagine that these ambassadors, with their quite fine and elaborate dress, must have been, objects of real fascination when they arrived in Prague in the early 17th century. And therefore, I'm sure it didn't take long for Sadler or perhaps Rudolf to say, well, we should really memorialize them with portraits. The case is slightly different with Mohammad Reza Beg. He is an interesting character. He was really the mayor of Yerevan. And it is said that he was an ambassador to Louis XIV. In fact, he never presented any credentials. And there is some thought that this was a kind of a mission, an economic sort of trade mission, as it were, that was not actually officially sent out by Shah Sultan Hussein. We don't know who the artist was who did his portrait. we have both the seated portrait, as you see here, and also some equestrian portraits. The equestrian portraits are very much in the style of the way Louis XIV himself was depicted on horseback, with very sumptuous horse trappings as well. So that's a kind of stylized view of Mohammad Reza Beg, which was clearly fashionable in royal circles at that time. And these are very different, obviously, than this miniature by Antoine Coypel, which really looks like it is done from life, and it is meant to be very realistic. He was a court painter, as you can see, and this miniature was sold not that long ago by Sotheby's. Another very interesting pair of portraits was done by Vladimir Borovikovsky of Morteza Qoli Khan, a brother of Aga Muhammad Shah. Catherine II was unhappy with the situation in Iran, particularly with the economic relations with Iran. And it was her intention to depose Aga Muhammad Shah and install his brother as her vassal. He traveled to Russia, and she, in fact, did not want him to come all the way to St. Petersburg. She wanted him to remain in the south so that when the time was right, he could easily be parachuted in, so to speak, back into Iran as her vassal. That never happened, and he ended up dying in Russia. But clearly also, he did manage to make his way to St. Petersburg, because that is where he was painted. Borovikovsky is actually a Ukrainian, but considered the Russian Gainsborough. And this portrait is in many ways interesting to juxtapose, both if you take a look at his gray garment and his very dark outer garment, to juxtapose with another one, and you see there are figures in the background and landscape. And then we have this one where there are no figures. There's there's more landscape, as you can see. And now the colors of the garments that Morteza Qoli Khan is wearing are very different. And yet the two portraits are very, very similar. So I was communicating with the art historian Polly Blakesley at Cambridge, who's a great expert on Russian painters of this period. And, you know, we were sort of puzzling as to why there are two so similar with different dress. And it was only when I was looking for good images of these that I realized something I should have realized earlier, which has to do with the scale of these paintings. So this shows you clearly that the one on the left is almost 3 meters high and almost 2 meters wide. It's a huge, huge painting, whereas the other one is a fraction of that size, just over 0.5 meter wide and 42 centimeters tall. So again, we don't know exactly what the explanation is. Perhaps the large one was meant really to be kept at the Hermitage or kept in St. Petersburg for the Empress, Catherine II. Perhaps this small one was meant to be given as a token to Morteza Qoli Khan. We don't really know. If it was, it presumably was not actually delivered, because it's still in Russia. It's now in Moscow in the Tretyakov Gallery. But when you see the two side by side, it's interesting to see how similar they are, and yet how the coloration of the dress is so very different. I'm jumping ahead now to the early 19th century. We have a couple of sort of buried treasures. If one looks at Jaubert's volume Voyage en Arménie et en Perse, which tells all about his amazing journeys and his imprisonment in Eastern Turkey, we have this small, fairly unassuming lithograph reproduced. It's a lithograph by a Danish lithographer, Willem Hoyer, who is reasonably well known, nothing sort of incredibly important about him. He did study in Paris, however, and that's probably how he got the commission for this work. And this is done after a miniature by the Swiss artist Amélie Romilly, which in turn is done, and she was in Geneva, so she clearly never saw Abbas Mirza, but this was done after a sketch by the young Swiss officer, a military engineer, Auguste de Bontemps. Auguste de Bontemps was part of General Gardan's military mission to Fatali Shah. And like several of his colleagues, he spent most of his time with Abbas Mirza. And that is obviously how he, when he did that sketch. He taught military engineering. He also drilled infantry, and he even supervised new uniforms for Abbas Mirza. So he had to oversee cobblers and tailors and armorers, all kinds of craftsmen in order to outfit Abbas Mirza's soldiers. Amélie Mounier, who married Amélie Romilly married David Mounier in 1821. She was a very, very prolific Swiss portraitist. Both of them came from Geneva, and therefore I think there's a possibility that they knew each other or their families knew each other, and that could explain how this sketch of Bontemps got handed over to Amélie Romilly to be turned into a miniature. She was very prolific, painting over 5,000 portraits in her career. And if you have a spare $3,000 or so, you can buy, there are several for sale. I've seen at various galleries, European galleries at the moment. The story of these French soldiers is, which I came to through the study of newspaper reports in the United States, is I've now also told in another book, this book called A Nook in the Temple of Fame, just about the French soldiers who went to train the military of Abbas Mirza and Muhammad Ali Mirza. Another work that appears in Jaubert's volume is this image of Asghar Khan Afshar, who was sent by Fatali Shah to Paris as his ambassador to Napoleon. This is after the Treaty of Finkenstein was signed. Again, this is a lithograph that appears in Jaubert's book by Hoyer, and it's written, it's actually printed in the book that this is after a work by Louis-Francois Aubry, which was drawn from life. Aubry was a very important French miniaturist. And I remember really to read that, you don't see it on this, in my page, the page is cropped here. You don't see his name, but it appears in a minuscule print, which I think I had to use a magnifying glass to read. And I wondered at the time, I remember when I realized that, I wondering whether that could still be extant, the actual miniature. In the same way, I wonder about the miniature of Abbas Mirza, which I have not been able to find. But in this case, reading an article about the French diplomacy of the early 19th century, basically the Gardan mission and what led up to it, by a retired and now deceased French naval admiral, he commented in his article that he said something to the effect that we have in my family a portrait by Aubry of Asghar Khan. And I thought, that's it. That's got to be it. And in fact, it was it. And through a circuitous roundabout way, because I had the name of that French admiral who'd written that article, I discovered a website of retired French naval officers. I contacted the webmaster, was able to get in touch with the son of this deceased French admiral, Olivier Silvestre. And to make a long story short, they immediately said, yes, we have that miniature. It's one of our prized possessions. And they very generously allowed me to have photographs and to illustrate it in this book. And there, it's interesting just to compare the lithograph of Wilhelm Heuer, which is in reversed stance, with the actual miniature itself. And you can see, and this is only 3 by 2 inches. It's an incredibly fine piece of work. Aubry is considered one of the very best of the French miniaturists of this period, when miniatures were really a sort of huge thing. Some writers about his work have said that sadly he didn't leave behind, or there have not survived as many miniatures of his as of others, largely because he also spent a lot of time teaching. And many other French miniaturists who are considered very important were his students. Nevertheless, if you have a look at the garment that Asghar Khan is wearing, and also at his turban, it's interesting then to look and see that on this large pastel portrait by Giraudet, a pupil of David's, it looks like he's wearing the very same garment under his outer cloak here. And probably it looks like it's the same turban as well, though tied a little bit differently, or wrapped a little bit differently, much taller and less sort of bulbous than it is in the Aubry version. So Asghar Khan went to Paris, and he clearly was a popular figure there, and clearly seems to have enjoyed his time in Paris, because his portrait was done quite a few times. So we've got the Aubry miniature. We now have this pastel by Giraudet. We have this sketch by David himself, which is also I was able to publish for the first time. It is in a gallery in London, Simon Ray gallery, and it's got written vertically, as you can see, croquis or sketch of Asghar Khan, ambassador of the King of Persia in 1808 by David. And the stance of Asghar Khan in the sketch is, I think, very reminiscent of the stance in the Giraudet portrait. So one wonders whether it's just another profile view, or whether they actually both sketched him at the same sitting. There are also a couple of very striking oil portraits of Oscar Khan. This one by Joseph Frank, yet another pupil of David's, is in the Pushkin Museum in Moscow. Frank is not that well known, although this is really, I think, a remarkable portrait when you take a close look at the fabric. Now he's wearing a very different turban, as you can see, different kind of cloth, but his main garment and his cummerbund are really incredible, as well as his fur-lined cloak. Frank emigrated first to Tuscany and then to Naples, and stayed in Italy for the rest of his life, becoming a professor of painting there. This portrait is also very interesting in the first place because it's by a female painter, Césarine Dava Mirvo, again, yet another pupil of David's. She actually also studied with a couple of his rivals. A couple of writers were very sort of dismissive of her because they said she learned to paint because she needed a profession. She needed to be a teacher so that she could earn an income. And indeed, she did found a painting school in Paris for young women, which she operated for almost 50 years. But this one, again, is remarkable. The cloak is the same one, or very similar to the one that is shown in the pastel portrait by Girodet, judging by the pattern on the outer, what looks like cotton outside of the fur. But the main garment, the golden garment, is really quite extraordinary, with the blue trim inside and the floral pattern and the cummerbund. I mean, it's really, and not to mention the carpet that he's kneeling on. So he's wearing the same turban that we've seen before in the Aubry and Girodet portraits. So clearly he was a popular figure for portrait painters when he was in Paris. And finally, we have this bronze medallion. Unfortunately, we don't know who cast this, but I just draw your attention, particularly the fact of its size. It's over a foot in diameter. So I called it a medallion, but it is not what we tend to think of as a small thing of a couple of inches in diameter. This is really quite a big bronze plate. And it's in the collection of a descendant of Napoleon's, Charles-André Colonna-Walewski. Now, we move in time just a little bit later, or almost contemporary, actually, but we move now to London. And now we have a series of portraits of Mirza Abul Hassan Khan, sent by Fath Ali Shah. He accompanied Sir Harford Jones. So this is, for those of you not that familiar with the history, we're really dealing with two ships passing in the night. As Sir Harford Jones arrived in Tehran, Gardan had just left. And Oscar Khan, as I've said, had gone to Paris. But meanwhile, the situation changed. The political situation changed dramatically because of the fact that Napoleon signed a treaty with Russia. Therefore, he was no longer interested in using Iran as an ally against Russia. And the idea of invading the British Indian domains was also scrapped. So Sir Harford Jones came to Iran, negotiated a treaty with Fath Ali Shah, and Mirza Abul Hassan Khan then went back to London to get the ratified treaty. As you can see, he arrived in the autumn of 1809, and then he left in the following summer. He was accompanied by James Justinian Morier, the author of Haji Baba of Isfahan, and an important figure in that early 19th century period from the British point of view. Now, this was a portrait that was commissioned by the East India Company, and they had it done by Sir William Beechey, one of the most prominent portraitists in Britain at that time. Once again, the textiles are extraordinary. The richness of the garments worn by Abul Hassan Khan are of the same order as those worn by Asghar Khan, and this is just the first of several. Sir William Beechey did a second one, very different, as you can see here, a much more relaxed depiction of Asghar Khan, in which he is not wearing sort of his full dress regalia. He looks like he's in the kind of clothes he might be wearing at home when he wasn't really expecting to see anybody. And Sir William Beechey's wife, Lady Anne Beechey, was also a portraitist, though primarily a miniaturist. She did this one, which you see here. I only have a black and white depiction of it. But once again, the position of Abul Hassan Khan's head and his stance, as well as his garment and his turban, are so similar that I assume they were probably done in one of the same sittings as when the oil portrait was done. This portrait has an inscription on the back of it, and you can see that it was given by Admiral Lord Radstock to Elizabeth, Countess of Waldegrave. This was a distant cousin of his. And in fact, again, going back to the newspaper reports that I studied for that book, Agreeable News from Persia, it's very clear that the Radstocks and Waldegraves were socially very connected with Abul Hassan Khan when he was in London. There are reports of evening, soirees and balls and dinners at which they were all present. Another very eminent portraitist of the time was Sir Thomas Lawrence. And he did this portrait, and according to his biographer, D.E. Williams, he always considered this one of the best portraits he ever did, even though it is not, I think, one of the portraits that one thinks of, or that at least that art historians tend to think of when they are talking about Lawrence. This was painted in the summer of 1810, shortly before Sir Gore Ouseley, who was sent back to Iran as ambassador, left with accompanying Mirza Abul Hassan Khan. For those of you who don't know, they had quite a wild journey. They went to Brazil first, so they crossed the Atlantic. Then they went down and around the Cape of Good Hope, and then up into the Persian Gulf. Ouseley later wrote a letter to Lawrence's biographer, Williams, and told him what he clearly considered was a very funny story. He said that so Ouseley took this portrait to Iran with him, and he had it in his house, in the residence in Tehran. And Fatih Ali Shah's prime minister, Mirza Shafi, came in one day and saw it. And he began to speak to it, berating Abul Hassan Khan for being seated in the presence of Sir Gore Ouseley. And of course, there was silence because he was talking to a painting. And then he said, well, if you're not going to stand up for the envoy of a foreign power, at least the least you can do is stand up when your prime minister enters the room. And at this point, Gore Owsley was really laughing and said, hang on. That is not the man himself. That is not Mirza Abul Hassan Khan. That is a painting. And Mirza Shafi went up to it, clearly, it seems, never having seen such a large portrait. He may have known miniatures. And he went up to it, and when he realized it was a flat painted surface, he was completely astonished. He said, I could have sworn that was the man himself sitting here. So that sort of supports Lawrence's own view that this really was one of the best portraits he ever did. Now, Abul Hassan Khan went a second time to Europe about 9 years later, and he accompanied Mirza Abul Hussein Shirazi to all the way to Vienna. On his way, he was on his way to Paris and then to London. And this was to be the new Persian ambassador to France I, sent by Fatali Shah. And there he had Mirza Ali Hussein had his portrait painted by Moritz Daffinger, who was a very, very prominent miniaturist, has left many, many miniatures. And really, when you get up close to this, it's strikingly realistic to the extent that you can really see very clearly just what's depicted on the decorations that the ambassador is wearing, suspended by ribbons, in one case from his neck, and one is probably pinned onto him here. So this, and he's got the very classical Persian Astrakhan high cap, but even, down to the hairs of his mustache. It's very, very fine work. This is not the only time he had his portrait done in Vienna. We have only from a newspaper a depiction, and not a very good one, of what was originally actually a color lithograph by another very important Austrian painter, primarily a genre painter of the early 19th century in Austria, Peter Fendi. So this is the only reproduction I have found of this, and I do not know if the original is still extant. But just it's a shame that it's in gray tone, because Fendi was a real pioneer in color lithography, and he was doing lithographs with 7 and 8 colors at a very early date in the 19th century. So the original, even though the original does not sort of give the impression of the realism of Daffinger's when it comes to the features, it looks much more stylized, but nevertheless, it would be very interesting to see this in color. Now, Mirza Abul Hassan Khan, as I said, went to Paris, and then he went to London. Interestingly, we have this lithograph by a very important French lithographer, de Lasteyrie, after a drawing by Delacroix. But again, it's strange knowing Delacroix's paintings. This doesn't exactly strike one as a wonderful human likeness in proportions, if nothing else. So one wonders whether the lithographer has had a role to play here in making this less good than than the original might have been. The same as it can be said of this one. We don't know who the artist of this one was, but it was again done while Mirza Abul Hassan Khan was in Paris. And the interesting thing here, I think, among other things, is the fact that the decorations, the Order of the Lion and Sun, that sort of thing that are being worn, are suspended from the turban, not worn around the neck or on the chest. Then we get to London, and here we have again a portrait which is almost, it's not quite naive or primitive, but it's clearly not of the same quality of a Lawrence or a Beechey. We have the lithograph from a very prominent printing studio, the studio of Bartolozzi. It probably wasn't done by Gaetano Bartolozzi. These are clearly an Italian family that had set up shop in London. He was no longer alive, but the studio continued. And it says on it, it was drawn by the Honorable Miss E. It took me a long time, but finally, almost by pure chance, I stumbled upon something and am 99.9% sure that the Honorable Miss E is Emily Eden. She was the sister of the Governor General of India, and went out to India for about 3 years and lived with her brother. And she produced a work called Portraits of the Princes. Sorry, I can't even see my my title here, but you can see, of India by Miss Eden. And there is, apart from the fact that this prince has his feet on a stool like Mirza Abul Hassan Khan does as well, there's a certain kind of physical similarity, I'd say, in the depiction of the human form here. So I think the Honorable Miss E is almost certainly Emily Eden. We also have this lithograph by Massimo or Maxime Gaucci, a Maltese artist who came to London and was considered one of the most important lithographers working there. Interestingly, he is known for his botanical illustrations, and somewhat bizarrely also as the, quote, father of music hall artists, by which I mean that if you think of sheet music, of popular songs, they often have a cover page, and that cover page might have a picture on it, and those were done by Gaucci. So that was his sort of claim to fame, but he dedicated this portrait to Sir Gore Ouseley, as you see, and he drew it from nature. And again, it's very interesting because of particularly, I think, because of the decorations, the orders that Mirza Abul Hassan Khan had received by the time he came back the second time to London. He clearly was a far more important figure, and he really, his chest and his turban are really covered with these orders that he is permitted to wear. Now, jumping quickly, I realize I should move right along to 1829. We have the very famous mission of Khosrow Mirza, the son of Abbas Mirza, the young son of Abbas Mirza, sent by Fatih Ali Shah to offer an official apology for the lamentable deaths of Griboyedov, the Russian ambassador, and most of the legation at the hands of a mob in Tehran. This portrait, this watercolor by Berger, is seemingly very, very lifelike. We know very little, if hardly anything, about the artist himself, unfortunately, but it seems like a real sketch from life that is pretty well unvarnished and meant to depict him just as he was. And as you can see, he is not wearing very fine clothes in the way that Asghar Khan and Mirza Abul Hassan Khan are largely depicted, apart from that one portrait of Beaches. Here's another more stylized portrait of him, I'd say, by the artist Karl Hampeln. Hampeln was a deaf mute from Austria, and when Nicholas I was on a visit to Vienna, he was presented to the Tsar, who then kind of became his patron and brought him back with him to St. Petersburg. And he did a series of portraits. I won't show you all of them, but he did this one of Khosrow Mirza, and then he did several other members of Khosrow Mirza's entourage, including Mirza Saleh, who is known for a number of things, including the beginnings of lithography and printing in Iran. He was sent with the entourage, and he was meant to acquire a lithographic press. His title here is Chief Secretary of Abbas Mirza. And then we have Khosrow Mirza's physician as well, Mirza Baba. And there's at least one other, which I don't have an image of to show you. Interestingly, the portrait of Khosrow Mirza appears in passing in a short story by Gogol, who talks about finding a copy in a flea market in Russia, in St. Petersburg or Moscow. Can't exactly remember now. And then we get now to the portrait that set me off on this sort of wild goose chase. And that is the portrait that you see here of Mar Johanna, the Bishop of Ormia, by a Swiss artist, Charles Fendrich. Charles Fendrich emigrated to the United States, and he was initially in Philadelphia, where he presumably met Pierre-Étienne Duval, who was a French lithographer, very important for the history of lithography in the United States. But Fendrich then moved on to Washington, and there he set up a studio, and he was very successful doing lithographic portraits of American presidents, American senators, and secretaries, high-ranking officials. Now, Mar Johanna came to the United States in 1842 with Justin Perkins, who had established the American Presbyterian mission in Ormia in the early 1830s, as I mentioned earlier. So we know that Mar Johanna was the first Persian to visit the White House. He went and visited President Tyler. And he clearly was, and he being a Christian bishop and Perkins being a missionary and very religious, they went around for 10 months and they visited and spoke at countless churches and countless religious meetings of large gatherings of religious societies. And he appears in the newspapers constantly for much of that time. And again, this is how I discovered him. In case you're wondering about what he's wearing there, his blue garment and his large cashmere shawl turban and the cap that's behind it, the red cap with the long tassel, it's interesting to compare the way he's depicted with these two much more primitive depictions of a couple of bishops that were published in Perkins' Residence of 8 Years in Persia in 1843, and with the subscript in the list of illustrations by Perkins, drawn by a Persian artist under my supervision. So these are not by a Western artist or one of the missionaries. These are by a Persian, but with some guidance, you could say, from Perkins. And the dress is very similar, even if the color scheme is not entirely always identical. But the dress and the cap and the turban are extremely similar. We have that rather stylized portrait of Fendrix, but then we also have this lithograph by Jarvis Griggs Kellogg, who is from a very prominent family of printers, very active in the Boston area, but also at New Haven. And it is after an oil portrait by Charles Hubbard. It appeared in a book, as you can see here, in an article accompanying a chapter following the visit of Mar Yohanan, that talks about less about him than about the Church of the East. Charles Hubbard is not exactly a household name when you think of American portrait painters. The reason being that portraiture was not his main line of work. When he was younger and when he first started, say 20 years earlier, we can look at this advertisement from a sort of commercial, almost like the Yellow Pages of Boston at that time, showing what he did. So he's advertising himself. He can paint military standards. He can paint clock faces. He can paint coaches, the bodies of coaches, carriages, military standards, and signs. And in fact, this drum in the Museum of Fine Arts is probably painted by Hubbard. There's very little of his real painting work outside of this commercial artwork that has survived. There is this one painting that I've managed to track down, which is really a family portrait that he did. And I think it shows that he's not exactly in the top tier of painters when it comes to the human form. But having said that, his portrait of Mar Yohanna has a certain realism about it, which is much more plausible, I'd say, than Fendrix. Also, the features, his nose, for example, and his body and his scale are very reminiscent of the way he's depicted here in this really remarkable silhouette by Auguste Edouard, which was done when Perkins and Mar Yohanna visited Saratoga Springs in upstate New York in the summer of 1842. Edouard is considered the greatest silhouettist who ever lived. And he spent years in the United States. He also spent years in Britain. And it's remarkable when you really get a close look, the hairs of his beard or his mustache, the nose is just like we see in Hubbard's painting, the tassel coming off of the cap, which is on top of his turban. It's really very, very lifelike. And Edouard wrote a whole book about the art of silhouette work and was very, very adamant that a silhouette was could be every bit as instructive as a regular sort of standard portrait. I want to quickly just end with one person who is not, whose portrait was not done in the West, and that's why I didn't include it in my book. It was done in Constantinople, but this was a brother of Abbas Mirza, and Hulagu Mirza, cousin of Muhammad Shah, was in Constantinople as a refugee. And he was drawn there by a couple of painters, painted and drawn. Sir David Wilkie, you see here in one that's in the Royal Academy. And then you see this sketch for a painting or probably a watercolor and chalk. And he talks in his diary about going to visit Hulagu Mirza. And he talks a little bit They are also about the dress and how distinctive the dress was, that when you're in Constantinople, you see people of all sorts, and they're very, very distinctively differentiatable by their dress. Another artist, John Frederick Lewis, also depicted Hulagu Mirza here in a quite a rapid sketch where he's holding a sword. And then this watercolor in the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, both done in 1840-41. And this was, these sketches must have been, or are thought to have been the basis ultimately for this painting, in which he is not identified, but which clearly looks like the same person, a startling account in which he is sitting on a divan and he's looking at a piece of paper that is clearly showing him some financial figures he probably doesn't really like very much. So with that, I will end. I'm very sorry. I know I've gone a bit over time there. So thank you very much for your attention, and I hope that was interesting for you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Potts, and no, not at all. I think we all enjoyed this really fascinating presentation, full of colorful and of course black and white images. Interesting. I would like to invite Dr. Diba and Dr. Floor. Dr. Diba, would you like to have the discussion at the same time with Dr. Floor? Do you have like a particular format for this, or would you like to go individually sharing comments?
Individually, because I prepared some remarks.
By all means, please go ahead. Thank you very much.
First, I would thank you, Mustafa and Daniel, for inviting me.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for joining us.
I wish to dedicate these remarks to the brave women and men of Iran. Daniel Potts' latest publication on visual representation of Persian envoys to Europe and America, 1600 to 1842, is indeed a welcome addition to Qajar studies. It discusses some well-known portraits and add new works to the canon, which we had not seen before, which reveal the extent and the depth of the author's detective skills. Publication also provides extensive discussions of European painters themselves, many of whom are lesser-known figures. Two questions immediately came to mind. Why this chronological framework when the Qajar era does not end until 1907? And why no discussion of royal portraits, portraits of royal Persian rulers could not have been included? Of course, you can't write about everything. The framework is clear from what Daniel's presentation, and his interest in the depiction of traditional Persian clothing seems to have been a major motivation. It would be instructive, I think, to broaden the parameters of investigation as Persian visitors to Europe increased exponentially in the second half of the 19th century. The era of photography, which fascinated many Persians, and many of them had their portraits taken by the great photographers of the day, such as Nadar. It would be interesting to see the study, hopefully, broadened to include this. Consideration of the question of Persian royal portraiture is also interesting, or minor vein of investigation. We do know that Safavid rulers were eager to see images of European rulers, and it is only in the mid-18th century that the Persian ruler Nader was the subject of great curiosity in Europe and frequently represented in European historical accounts of his exploits, as admirably argued by Janet O'Brien in a recent dissertation. Whereas in the Safavid period, the rulers did not send portraits of themselves, but rather carpets and textiles. As for the era of Fatih Shah, opportunities for European depictions were limited since he never traveled outside the Persian domains. The world came to him, and rarely envoys such as Care Porter or Saltykov, who had painterly skills, actually painted his portrait or did drawings of Fath Ali Shah. Fath Ali Shah commissioned his portrait from his own court artist, and therefore it is the image he wished to project, which is preserved in European collections. This brings me to the question of the comparison of European and Persian ideas of portraiture raised by the author in his introductory remarks. These are two parallel but separate developments. Persians were interested since the 15th century, the Timurid era of the master Behzad, in verisimilitude, but not in a scientific application of the laws of perspective, spatial recession, and modeling, as in post-Renaissance Europe. These did not come to Persia until the late 19th century, with the introduction of photography and the teaching of European-style academic painting in Tehran. However, let's see if there is any influence or interaction between these two traditions. Indeed, during the late Safavid period, a Perso-European school of Persian, which actually I think represented the closest moment of contact between these two traditions. It emerged in Isfahan, associated with Muhammad Zaman, and it is essentially developed from printmaking, which was, there were numerous examples in Safavid Isfahan. The 18th century, in terms of development, there was a decline, and a certain level of interaction resumes in the early 19th century in what we call a style of hybridity. But actual interaction didn't occur until after the dates of publication. By 1861, an academy of painting, the Dar al-Funun, was established at the royal court in Tehran, and European-style academic painting was taught by European trained Persian artists, especially Mirza Ali Akbar Mozayan Dole. The mutual interaction of European and Persian painting reached its apogee with the naturalistic style of portraiture practiced by Muhammad Baqir Kamalelo. Throughout this period, European reactions to Qajar paintings, which Dan asked me about, were invariably negative, even scornful, especially in the cases of Care Porter, Mourier, and Rochechouart, who are legendary names in Persian travel accounts. The paintings were rendered in a decorative and idealized court style, very much out of fashion in Europe and only too well known to artists like Care Porter. Others, such as Usli, had a sort of vague appreciation of Persian miniature painting and lacquer work, so they would be interested in miniature, but not in the medium of large-scale painting, which was considered to be the European domain. Only S.G.W. Benjamin, the American envoy, the first American envoy to Iran in the late 19th century, had anything good to say about Persian painting. However, if you look at it, the style of the works commissioned by Fath Ali Shah and those that Daniel has shown us throughout his book were not that different. As the author states, his research is intended to put faces to many historical figures, some of whom left accounts and are referenced in the text, primarily used to date the paintings. Daniel does discuss Mirza Abul Hassan's journal rather briefly, but I would love to see further analysis of his visits to artist studios and exhibitions and his reactions to the art. It would be fascinating. There is also, by the way, an account of his visit to St. Petersburg, which may be revealing. And now I pass just to two more additions to this gallery of rogues, which I don't have a PowerPoint of, but I will show you the image. The first is to be published in a forthcoming article by myself, is the visit of a Persian artist, Muhammad Jafar, to Russia in the early 19th century. Russian archives and newspaper accounts describe his host's reactions, who took great pains to make him comfortable and to create an atmosphere of welcoming, and which is compared to later attitudes is quite different. His visit lasted for 2 years, and he graduated from the St. Petersburg Academy of Art. A visual record of his visit is left in a watercolor portrait, which you see on the screen here, for which he received a silver medal. And the portrait depicts Crown Prince Abbas Mirza, who had sent him to St. Petersburg. This is still held in the St. Petersburg Academy of Fine Arts today. Another little-known source, but similar to some we've seen, but also different, was Colonel F. Colombari, who worked for Muhammad Shah, training his army from 1833 to 48. And he was also a Sunday painter, and he penned some watercolor sketches of sometimes political figures, such as Haji Mirza Akasi here, of the Zamburakchi or Camel Corps, and another very penetrating watercolor of the interpreter Davoud. So I think these two examples show, I think, the range, the possible range of the subject in the future as a rich source of investigation. The text also complements and expands studies of the relations between Europe and the West as seen through the prism of travel accounts, such as by authors Rudi Mate and Hamid Dabashi, which has resulted in a rich body of work which begins with Dennis Wright's publications on the mutual experiences of the English and the Persians in the 19th century. Wright's approach was essentially Orientalist and Anglophile, attitudes critiqued in the more recent scholarship. For instance, in his analysis of European travel accounts, Rudi Mate has shown how European attitudes to Persians changed from admiration in the 17th century to condescension, or I would even say contempt, by the 19th century, as firsthand knowledge of the decline of Persia emerged. If we apply this conclusion to the publication, all the works that have presented herein correspond to the period of admiration by Europeans for the Persians, with changing attitudes, even in the 1840s, not yet reflected in diplomatic relations and the imagery it generated. Other scholars, such as Tawakkoli Tariqi, as well as Dabashi, have emphasized that this was an era of mutual looking, sometimes of admiration, sometimes critical, and that the Persians were actually quite sophisticated in their evaluations of Europeans. Concept of a hybridity in art and of a mutual consciousness, which have now emerged, would be interesting to incorporate into our discussion of the works. From this perspective, the author's subjects were represented as Oriental types, dressed in luxurious clothing corresponding to Orientalist tropes of the exotic other in the official court style current in Europe. Nevertheless, they do seem to provide a stronger sense of realism than if you look at representations of the same envoys, which I'm sure we could find in actual Qajar royal portraiture, which is really a very iconic, decorative, and emotionless. It is of interest to note Persian textiles and rugs were always a major commodity in trade with Europe, which explains the attention still being paid to depicting lavish clothing in the envoys' official portraits, rather than to emphasizing their character, which is also typical of the Orientalist mindset, as first argued by Edward Said. This publication wonderfully documents an important chapter of this complex and ambivalent relationship, which we no longer perceive in binary terms, but more as a process of mutual interaction and observing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Diba, for your very thoughtful and insightful intervention. Then at this point, I would like to invite Dr. Floor to join us and Dr. Potts and Dr. Diba for any discussion or comments or questions you might want to share with us. Thank you.
Okay. I can't start my view. How do I start the video?
There must be like a button.
Yes, I clicked on it and it doesn't work. It says you cannot stop your video because you have stopped it. I don't know. Anyway, if people don't see me, they can hear me, I presume.
I'm sorry, Dr. Flor. We might be, yeah, just I was thinking maybe we can ask Mortaza.
Yes, I'm there.
There you are.
Oh,
Very good.
okay, people can see me now in all my glory.
Yes.
Well, yes. Well, Dan, thank you very much for a wonderful book, and what it shows how happenstance is an important fact of an historian's or even an archaeologist's life, because you never know where you end up to, and that's the fun, and that you go out of your comfort zone and go to somewhere else and you find a new world, and you share it with us in the most colorful way. I think, let's say, the three books that you showed, not only the one that you just discussed, but also the newspapers and the French offices, I think are a wonderful addition to our sources. I think, let's say, yes, it is important to publish those pictures. Most of them people don't know, and as the famous saying goes, you know, a portrait says more than 1,000 words. In this case, maybe more than 1,001 words. And indeed, it is a pleasure to see, and I think it is a wonderful addition to the textile artifacts that we have, to see in what way the images, let's say, confirm or not what we know from the remaining artifacts of this period. The first thing that struck me, that you had only shown one picture of Hussein Ali Beg Bayat, because there's another one also by Sadler, and I show this here, which is interesting for more than one reason, because it shows the Southern Lion thing, which is not shown in the other picture by Sadler, and otherwise, let's say, it is basically the same. What I also would like to say, you know, there is this wonderful picture of, let me see, what is the guy's name? I'm very bad at names. Oh dear. Oh yeah, Gabriele Cagliari. In, you know, Venice was an important commercial center in the 17th century, and since the medieval times was an important source of products that were marketed at Venice. And during the Safavid period, quite a number of ambassadors, commercial ambassadors are. Now, quite a few actually came, especially during the time of Abbas I. And in 1604, it so happened that there were about quite a few. In fact, there were 6 Muslim Persians and 3 Armenian Persians who came to the Doge and were invited by the council, and the Doge gave orders to Cagliari to make this beautiful picture, which I think, you know, would have made a wonderful addition to your book. The more so since it shows variations in the depiction of, let's say, the clothing of the people. Clearly, these were not noblemen; these were rich merchants, and which is also clear, let's say, from the expensive gifts that they gave, as well as the expensive gifts that they received from Venice for Abbas I. Yeah, another omission, I would almost say, is a rather strange ambassador, Sir Robert Shirley. He also was dressed rather wonderfully and quite wonderfully painted with his wife. And although he was not a native Persian. Nevertheless, he was formally acknowledged by the British court as an ambassador, although Naftali Bek made problems about that. But nevertheless, I think he should have been there, if only, let's say, he's such a colorful figure in more than one sense. Yes, and and I gather where Layla is coming from. That say, there are many more pictures. Indeed, there are, but I think, rightly or wrongly, but maybe also since the material is rather vast, that you limit yourself, let's say, to ambassadors and some royal types, because, let's say, there is a large variety of pictures. For example, wonderful pictures that you find in the British Library by Kempfer, where you have some very nice pictures of people in local dress, including women, and including religious types, and so on. And in particular, let's say, of course, Layla mentioned the Nader Shah. There are very, very nice pictures of Nader Shah of various natures, which I think by themselves need discussion. And then, of course, in the Qajar period, yes, I mean, there are so many, and there are, for example, just the book by Diba, which has scores of these things. I mean, where I think I would draw the line is the no, I would not draw the line, but let's say the photographs, yes and no, because many of the photographs, people show themselves in European costume, and that's rather boring, because it's uniform, literally. But indeed, there are court pictures, which are, I think, very interesting. And maybe, if you are digging up some other wonderful things, you come across another reference, and you can write another book, which would I think be welcomed by everybody, because I think not only did you paint all these pictures rather verbally, but also you gave it a colorful text. And I think books sometimes are a bore to read. Yours weren't and aren't, and I can everybody recommend not only the 3 books that he tried to sell to you this evening, but also even his archaeology book, which are a great source and an enjoyment to read. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Floor. So, Dr. Potts, would you like to comment or respond to any of these?
Thank you both. Thank you both so much for all of that. Yeah, why, I'm be the first to admit that there are paintings that escaped me that I didn't know about, but I also didn't want to venture into all of the work done by, let's say, by Western artists. I mean, first of all, it was meant to be about paintings done or portraits done in the West. So that's why things like Kempfer I didn't include, or Kurt Porter's portrait of Fatali Shah, for example. And the temporal cutoff is really something. Having done the survey of the newspaper articles, I could see all the trouble I'd be getting into if I went into Nasruddin Shah's reign. I would still be, you wouldn't have heard from me for the next 10 years. I think. So that was purely a practical consideration, that I preferred to do something that I could kind of feel that I could sort of wrap it up. And again, as you say, if you include photography, then we're talking more volumes and, just a much, much bigger study, and probably multiple books, not just just one. But thank you for all of that. And yeah, I mean, it was not my intention also to restrict it to the elite, hence the fact that I began with Mar Yohanna. He is the antithesis. And I think if Muhammad Shah ever knew what he said while he was in the United States, he would have had him executed the minute he set foot back home, because he was anything but flattering about the Shah. And it's interesting. I mean, it's nothing to do with portraits, but he was absolutely almost speechless when he saw President Tyler, because he said, you know, in my country, there's no way I could go into the palace of the Shah. Here, I'm being brought in to see the President of the United States, and there are no guards outside the door. There, you know, it's not heavily fortified. He could not believe that he was ushered in to see the president. And, you know, I'm sure that when he got back home, that really, well, I wonder, I know Muhammad Shah had newspapers read to him and news collated for him. I really wonder whether he knew anything about this. I mean, admittedly, much of the reporting was done in religious newspapers, you know, the Christian Observer and these sorts of things in New York and Philadelphia and Boston. So whether any of that reporting ever reached the ears of Muhammad Shah, I doubt. But he said some very unflattering things about Muhammad Shah, and just more about the sort of authoritarian nature of government and the downtrodden position of the people, really. So I tend to think that never reached Muhammad Shah's ears. But yeah, no, this was a case where I have to say I've been inspired by a certain historian named Willem, who once told me that whenever he was invited by Encyclopedia Iranica to do an entry, he thought about it and thought, well, I don't know anything about that. I'll do it. And that's the way you have fun and you learn something completely new that you hadn't worked on before. And again, this just led me down many paths that were entirely new to me. And I must say, in the modern day, we are so fortunate with the fact that literally millions and millions of books and journals have been digitized and newspapers have been digitized, that one can do all kinds of research that simply wasn't really conceivable in the pre-digitization era. So thank you so much for your comments, and I look forward to speaking with both of you more about all of that. Thank you so much.
Great, and thanks to all of you. So before I come back to the panelists, like for a goodbye or final remarks, I should also mention, Dr. Potts, that we have had some comments and slash questions. There is one question I would like to mention that. So we were accompanied by quite a few professors, and thank you for their presence. Dr. Firza Melville has been here. Dr. Houshang Shahabi has been here, I guess, and Ms. Fatima Soudavar Farmayan has been here. And so there are some comments by Dr. Melville. I would like to, well, we're a little bit short of time, but I'll just very quickly go through them. And a couple of them, they would like to bring to your attention two sketches for the portrait of Murtaza Qoli Khan. And they give addresses for them, like where they are. And they also mentioned that the sketches were produced not only for the artist himself, but also for circulation. And there's also a comment by Ms. Soudavar And they mention first a correction. Qajar ceremonial coats were almost invariably made of embroidered cashmere shawl made in Kashmir proper or copied in Kerman. Regarding the portrait of Abbas Mirza by the Swiss artist, does not look like him at all, according for them. The most realistic likeness, much copied by Iranian artists, is from Kerr Porter's book and is similar in facial features to the superb paintings of the prince in St. Petersburg, one of which was exhibited in Layla's Brooklyn Museum exhibition. There are also portraits of Safavid envoys to France and Spain, recently reproduced in books of conference proceedings held in Spain under the sponsorship of Sudavar Memorial Foundation, and the famous portrait of the three treasonous princes who fled to London. Their portrait is in a London bank, I believe. So my intention, of reading these is just so we have them in the recording, should the recording be released. It doesn't mean that, but of course, you're more than welcome to comment on them if you'd like, but it doesn't mean that we agree with everything. And Dr. Melville says, many thanks for the great talk and the images. There is a question, though, by an attendee named Shiraz Ramji, or Ramji. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing this, but they say excellent presentation. You had one picture with a slave serving a drink. Did you find any more pictures of slaves? Did the slaves travel with the Iranian ambassadors?
Oh, well, yeah, that I can't say for sure because Wilkie didn't explain. He just identifies that figure as a slave. But yes, I believe from what I remember of reading about Mirza Abul Hassan Khan that he had quite an entourage with him. So I think he did have his servants, his own personal servants with him. Whether they're exactly slaves, I can't say. But Willem, I'm sure, and Layla could probably say. I'm not sure. Yeah, and of course, there, as an outsider, of course, there are going to be things that I didn't know about, and whether they're published or unpublished or very recently published, of course, there are other things that could be added, I'm sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Potts. And of course, your humility is just instructive for someone like me, a junior researcher. And the last comment is by Dr. Melville, who basically they give us the address for, I think, one of the sketches, which has been reproduced at that address. And with that, I would like to, again, yes, come back to the panelists. For if there is any final remarks, please go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, I just have a suggestion about the identification of a slave. Maybe it's a misunderstanding of the word ghulam or ghulam khanezad, which were honorifics describing a position at the court, but originally would have meant slave. So maybe that was interpreted and misinterpreted as actual slave, because I doubt they would have taken at this period actual slaves with them. Or maybe it may have been a eunuch who was a member of the household. So that's my comment on terminology.
Yeah, if I may, I think it's most likely to be a slave because it was quite normal for elite families in the Qajar period to have slave, both male and female, some of the males eunuchs, some not, and it's quite likely, let's say, that a prince like that, certainly if he had money, that he was accompanied by members of his immediate family, which included slaves. One should, by the way, often it is said, slavery in Iran was not that bad because they were well treated. That's in general true. But I think, let's say, one should also realize that depended, let's say, slaves outside the elite families didn't have that comfortable life, and in particular in the southeast of Iran, most of the slaves there were used as field labor or as soldiers, and they lived generally a miserable life. But anyway, in this case of Abbas Mirza in Constantinople, he probably had his Batsheya Ghulam with him.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fleur and Dr. Diba. And of course, we know that fairly recently there has been some research, right, on quote unquote slavery in Iran. At least I know I'm sure all of us know Dr. Behnaz Mirzai, right, in Canada. But there are also some PhD students with very promising PhD dissertations allocated to the subject. So Dr. Potts, do you have any final remarks before we conclude?
No, I think not really. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, and thank you to Dr. Diba and Dr. Fleur for accepting our invitation. We really feel honored, and thanks very much to all of the attendees for participating and for also like staying up to now. I know that we went a little bit over time, but of course for good reasons. Plus we had 2 discussants. Okay, so our last slide, as usual, here our panelists have been generous enough to share their email addresses, and so they would welcome any comments / questions you might have. Thank you very much. And there's also a very short survey, and Mortaza will kindly help me with posting. Yes, he has already done that. Thank you, Mortaza. So if you would be kind enough to take that survey and let us know how we did or how we have been doing and how we can improve our work, that would be very much appreciated. Once again, thanks everyone, and I wish you all a wonderful rest of your day or night.
Don't forget the video.
Absolutely. I also wanted to actually mention that, so we'll be in touch with our audience and friends of the page through the page, especially through the Facebook page, in terms of what's to come afterward. There might be a short break coming up, particularly the next semester, but of course afterward we'll come again with a full list of lectures to be with our audiences. So thanks very much again, and you all have a great time.